My name is Mary Margaret O'Connor, though I was born Mary Margaret Gallagher, and for many years I carried the name Mary Margaret Miller. I was born on the 12th of October in the year 1843 in the city of New York, in the crowded, desperate district known as the 5 Points. I am now in my 86th year, and I have lived long enough to witness transformations that would have seemed impossible in my youth. I have seen the rise of great steel bridges, the advent of electric lights, and the spreading of telephone wires across the continent. But of all the extraordinary and terrible things I have experienced in my long life, none haunts me quite like the memory of a dusty train platform in Missouri, where a stranger unlaced my brother Thomas's hand from mine. I must begin at the beginning, for you cannot comprehend the magnitude of that separation without understanding first what we were to each other, and how completely we had already been stripped of everything else in this world. I was the elder of 2 children born to Michael and Bridget Gallagher. My parents had fled the famine in Ireland, arriving in New York with little more than the clothes on their backs and a desperate hope for survival. My father was a laborer, breaking his back on the docks of the East River, unloading cargo for pennies a day. It was exhausting work, dangerous work, and it provided barely enough for our family to survive. We lived in a single, dark room in a crowded tenement on Mulberry Street. We were impoverished, yet my mother managed our meager existence with a fierce, protective care. My brother Thomas was born in the bitter winter of 1846, when I was 3 years old. I have very few memories of life before Thomas. I remember the day my mother laid him in the drawer of an old dresser that served as his cradle. He was a frail infant, prone to chest colds and fevers, and my mother worried over him constantly. I was both fascinated and fiercely protective of him. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, he became my constant companion, my shadow, my responsibility. Our parents worked relentlessly, my father at the docks and my mother taking in piecework sewing late into the night. It fell to me, as the elder sister, to mind Thomas during much of the day. I taught him to walk in the narrow, crowded alleyways, holding him up above the filth of the streets. I shared my portions of stale bread with him when he cried from hunger. I told him stories to keep him quiet when the neighbors in the adjoining rooms grew violent or loud. He was my little brother, and I loved him with a fierceness that I did not entirely understand, but which seemed as natural as breathing. We were inseparable. If I went to the street pump for water, Thomas clutched my skirt and trotted along beside me. If I sat on the stoop to watch the wagons pass, Thomas sat firmly in my lap. Our family life was a daily struggle, but it was stable, predictable, secure in its own way. And then, in the late summer of 1852, when I was barely 9 years old and Thomas was 6, ship fever came to the 5 Points. Typhus was a disease we all feared. It struck without warning in the cramped, filthy tenements, spreading rapidly and killing with terrible efficiency. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. A burning fever, a dark rash across the chest, delirium, and a profound weakness that stripped the flesh from the bones within days. The epidemic raged through our building in August. My father contracted the disease first. He came home from the docks one evening, shivering uncontrollably despite the stifling summer heat. By morning, he was desperately ill. My mother could not afford a physician, and even if she could, few would enter our building. She bathed his face and prayed, but he died 3 days later. I remember my mother's face when the men from the city came to take his body away to the potter's field. Gray, exhausted, aged 10 years in 3 days. She gathered Thomas and me to her and told us our father was with God. Thomas, who was 6 and did not fully comprehend death, asked when he would return to us. Never, my mother said, her voice hollow. We had barely registered the loss of my father when my mother fell ill. Within days of my father's death, she was struck down. She lasted only 4 days. 4 days of watching her waste away, of feeling utterly powerless to help. I was 9 years old, trying to care for my dying mother and my terrified younger brother in a sweltering, infected room. My mother died on the 2nd of September, 1852. The last thing she said to me, gripping my hand with fingers that felt like dry twigs, was to take care of Thomas. Promise me, she whispered, her breath rattling in her chest. Promise me you will not let them separate you. I promise, I told her, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. But I was 9 years old, newly orphaned, with no money, no family in America, and no means to keep that promise. The landlord discovered us the next morning. Finding my mother dead and no rent money to be had, he summoned the authorities. We were taken from our room, crying and bewildered, loaded into a wagon, and transported to the orphan asylum on Randall's Island. That was the day our childhood ended. The asylum on Randall's Island was a massive, imposing structure of brick and stone, a place designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Hundreds of children were housed there, orphans and foundlings stripped of their ragged clothes, scrubbed with harsh soap, and issued uniform gray garments. The days were strictly regimented by the ringing of bells. We woke in the dark, ate bowls of thin gruel in silence, and were set to work scrubbing floors. And the cruelty of the place was its absolute indifference to our individual suffering. The most profound torment of the asylum was the strict separation of boys and girls. Thomas and I were placed in different wards, relegated to different yards for our brief periods of exercise. I fought against the matrons. I cried. I begged to be allowed to stay with my brother, explaining the promise I had made to our dying mother. They ignored me, treating my grief as an inconvenience. I learned to look for him across the dividing fences, my eyes searching the sea of gray-clad boys for his pale face. When I caught a glimpse of him, he looked terrified, shrinking away from the older boys. We remained in that cold institution into the spring of 1853. I was approaching my 10th birthday, and Thomas was 6. It was then that the directors of the asylum determined our fate. They believed that the crowded, sinful streets of New York were no place to raise indigent children, and that salvation lay in the pure, moral air of the West. We were to be sent out on the trains, placed with farming families who would teach us honest labor and Christian virtue. We were told we were going to a better life. We were bathed, dressed in stiff, ill-fitting clothes, and given a small Bible. A group of perhaps 40 children was gathered at the train depot. I found Thomas in the confusion and gripped his hand with desperate strength. We boarded the train, a terrifying, loud machine that most of us had never seen. For 3 days and nights, we rattled westward across the vast expanse of the country, sleeping on hard wooden benches, eating cold bread and cheese provided by the weary chaperones. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. The train journey was a blur of exhaustion and fear. Thomas was sick for much of the trip, his chest rattling with a cough that terrified me. I held him on my lap, wrapping my arms around him to shield him from the drafts blowing through the rattling cars. I whispered to him that we would be kept together, that I would work as hard as any grown woman if a family would only take us both. And I believe my sheer determination could force the world to honor my mother's dying wish. I was a child, profoundly ignorant of how little my determination mattered. We arrived finally in a small farming town in Missouri. The name of the town escapes me now, lost to the trauma of what occurred there. We were marched from the train station to the local opera house, a wooden building smelling of dust and stale tobacco. The townspeople had been notified of our arrival by flyers. They gathered in the hall, farmers and their wives, merchants and laborers, looking us over as if we were livestock at an auction. We were instructed to stand on the stage and look bright and healthy. The process of selection was humiliating and brutal. Men stepped up to the stage, feeling the muscles of the older boys, calculating how much labor could be extracted from them in exchange for board and keep. Women looked for girls to help with cooking, or infants to replace babies they had lost. Thomas clung to my skirt, his face buried in the coarse fabric of my dress. I stood as tall as a 10-year-old girl could stand, pulling him in front of me whenever a prospective family approached, loudly declaring that we were a pair, that I was strong and could work for two, provided my brother came with me. I stood upon that stage with my arm wrapped fiercely around Thomas's thin shoulders, a child attempting to defy the machinery of the adult world. For the first few hours we were passed over. Those seeking strong farm hands saw only a sickly 6-year-old boy and a scrawny girl. But as the afternoon wore on and the crowd thinned, a prosperous-looking farmer and his wife approached the stage. Their name was Sullivan. Mrs. Sullivan had a stern, uncompromising face, and she sought a girl to assist with the heavy domestic labor of a large farmhouse. She inspected my hands, noted my age, and nodded to the chaperone in charge of our group. "I will take the girl," she said flatly. "No," I cried out, pulling Thomas closer. "We must go together. I promised my mother. He's a good worker, I swear it." Mrs. Sullivan looked at Thomas with cool detachment. "He is sickly. I have no use for a weak boy and no time to nurse one. I'm taking the girl." Before I could protest further, another man stepped forward. He was a blacksmith named Mr. Callahan, a large man with hands blackened by soot. He had been watching the proceedings quietly. "I will take the boy," he said. "He is small, but he can be fed up. He can learn to work the bellows." The chaperone, a weary woman who had supervised dozens of these heart-wrenching auctions, stepped between us. "It is settled, then," she said briskly. The moment that followed is etched into my memory with the sharpness of a physical wound. The chaperone reached for Thomas's hand. I screamed, wrapping both my arms around his waist, dropping to the floor of the stage to anchor him. Thomas began to wail, a high panic sound that pierced the dusty air of the hall. He buried his face in my neck, his small fingers twisting into the fabric of my uniform. "Mary, you must let the boy go," the chaperone said, her voice strained with the effort of prying my fingers loose. "You are going to a good home. He is going to a good home. You cannot stay together, as you must accept this." I had no choice. I was 10 years old. I had no power, no authority, no ability to keep my promise to our mother. I was as much subject to the decisions of adults as Thomas was. Mr. Callahan, the blacksmith, stepped forward and pulled Thomas away from me with a firm, inescapable grip. Thomas screamed and reached for me, and I reached back, but Mrs. Sullivan held me by the shoulders. "This is hard, I know," she said, not unkindly but firmly, "but it must be done." Thomas was carried out the doors of the opera house, his small face red with terror, still calling my name. I was led to the Sullivans' wagon. As we rode away toward their farm, I looked back at the town, knowing my brother was somewhere in its streets, and I collapsed, sobbing silently into my hands. That was the last time I saw my brother for nearly half a century. My life with the Sullivans on their Missouri farm was not cruel, but neither was it warm. They were practical people, stretched thin by the demands of their land. I was given a small cot in the loft above the kitchen. I was fed adequately, clothed in practical homespun, and sent to the local school only during the winter months when my labor was not required in the fields or the house. But I was not cherished. I was an obligation, a source of cheap domestic labor acquired to ease the burden on Mrs. Sullivan. I learned quickly to make myself useful, to anticipate needs, to work from before dawn until long after dark without being asked. It was the only way to justify my presence in a household where resources were carefully managed. But I thought constantly of Thomas. In those first weeks and months, barely a moment passed when I did not wonder where he was, what he was doing, whether he was frightened, whether his cough had worsened. At night, lying on my cot, listening to the wind rattle the roof boards, I would close my eyes and try to picture his face, terrified that I might forget the exact shade of his brown eyes or the sound of his laugh. I begged Mrs. Sullivan to inquire after him in town. I knew Mr. Callahan was a blacksmith, and surely he could be found. But the Sullivans rarely went into the town where we had arrived, doing their trading at a closer settlement. When I pressed the matter, Mrs. Sullivan hushed me. She believed, as the asylum directors believed, that it was better for us to make clean breaks, to build new lives without the constant pain of remembering what we had lost. She thought she was being kind. She thought she was protecting me from futile longing. But that silence was a prison. I was completely cut off from the only blood I had left in the world, carrying the heavy, unbearable guilt of a broken promise. I did not know this at the time. Of course, I knew only that my pleas to Mrs. Sullivan were met with firm reprimands, and gradually I began to believe what seemed inevitable, that Thomas was lost to me forever. I buried my grief and my longing as deeply as I could, trying to build a life that did not ache constantly with his absence. When I was 18, in the spring of 1861, the nation erupted into war. The conflict between the states tore through Missouri with a particular and intimate violence as neighbors turned against neighbors. The Sullivans' eldest son, Matthew, was among the first to enlist in the Union Army, full of confidence and romantic notions of military glory. I remember the day he left the farm. Mrs. Sullivan wept as she embraced him, her usual sternness cracking under the weight of a mother's terror. Mr. Sullivan shook his hand gravely and told him to do his duty. I felt only a cold dread. Matthew was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August of that same year, barely months after he had enlisted. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen churning butter when I heard Mrs. Sullivan cry out. I ran to the parlor and found her collapsed on the floor. Matthew's death changed Mrs. Sullivan fundamentally. Grief hollowed her out, leaving behind a shell that went through the motions of living without any real engagement, and the farm work fell increasingly upon my shoulders and Mr. Sullivan's as the war ground on. Throughout those bitter years, I continued to think of Thomas. I wondered if the war had touched his life. I wondered if the blacksmith, Mr. Callahan, had been conscripted, or worse, if Thomas himself, who would have been 15 in 1861, had run off to join the fighting as a drummer boy or a private. I wondered if he was safe, if he was well, if he ever thought of me. In the spring of 1865, when I was 22 years old and the war had finally ended, I made one final attempt to locate my brother. I walked 5 miles to the nearest post office and paid the postage from my own small savings to send a letter addressed simply to Mr. Callahan Blacksmith in the town where we had been separated, begging for news of Thomas Gallagher. That letter, like the silent prayers I offered every night, went unanswered. I told myself that perhaps the blacksmith had moved or died in the war, or that the letter had gone astray. But I knew deep in my heart that I had to stop looking backward if I was to survive. In the autumn of 1865, I married a young man named James O'Connor. He had returned from the war that summer, having served 4 years with a Missouri infantry regiment. He had fought at Shiloh and Vicksburg, and he had survived when so many had not. But survival had come at a cost. The war had marked him in ways that were not immediately visible. James was 26 when we married, 4 years my senior. He was quiet, serious, with eyes that had seen too much. He did not speak of the war unless pressed. But I recognized in him a fellow sufferer, someone who carried wounds that would never fully heal. We courted briefly, carefully chaperoned by a still grieving Mrs. Sullivan, and married in November in a small Catholic ceremony. The Sullivans seemed relieved to have one fewer mouth to feed, though they gave us a milk cow and a set of dishes as a parting gift. James had secured a position as a tenant farmer on a stretch of land near the river. The arrangement came with a small, drafty cabin. The furniture was spare and utilitarian, but it was ours. For the first time since I had been taken from that tenement room in the 5 Points 13 years earlier, I had a place where I belonged. James was not a demonstrative husband, but he was steady and kind. He worked long hours in the fields, and I managed the household, cooked meals, kept the house clean, and tended a large vegetable garden. We fell into routines that were comfortable, if not exciting. Our first child, a daughter we named Bridget after my mother, was born in September of 1866. I was 23 years old and childbirth terrified me. I had no mother to guide me, no sister to comfort me. When the midwife placed Bridget in my arms, I felt a surge of protective love so intense it was almost painful. This child would not be separated from her family. this child would have the security I had been denied. Over the next 10 years, I bore 4 more children, and always I carried the shadow of the boy I had left behind. James, who had his own experience with sudden death from the war years, understood my deep-seated fears in a way others could not. He did not tell me to stop worrying or to simply be grateful for the blessings we had. He did not quote scripture to justify my lingering grief. He simply endured beside me, holding me when the nightmares of the asylum returned and keeping our family moving forward. I raised our children, Bridget, Michael, Sarah, John, and little Thomas, named for my lost brother, with a fierce determination that they would never doubt their place in the world, that they would never experience the abandonment that had marked my own childhood. I held them close, perhaps too close. I worried constantly about their safety, about fevers and coughs, about any circumstance that might take them from me. James understood this anxiety, though he sometimes gently suggested I was being overprotective. They must learn to live in the world, he would say, and I would reply that the world was entirely capable of crushing them, and he would smile sadly and let it go. The years passed with the steady rhythm of farm life, planting and harvest, birth and death, prosperity and struggle. James proved himself a highly capable farmer. Eventually, the landowner offered to sell us a portion of the river bottom, 80 acres of good soil, at a fair price. We accepted, and suddenly we were landowners with all the responsibility and opportunity that entailed. We prospered modestly. The farm produced well, and the children worked alongside us as they grew older. We were not wealthy, but we were secure, and security felt like immense wealth to someone who had known the starving streets of the 5 Points. Yet always in the back of my mind was Thomas. I imagined his life, where he lived, whether the blacksmith had been cruel, whether he had survived the war, whether he had children of his own. In 1898, when I was 55 years old, my husband James died. His lungs had never been the same after his years marching in the damp cold of the war, and a severe bout of pneumonia took him in the space of a single week. His death, though a shock, was the final toll of a bell that had been ringing since 1861. As a widow, I found myself once again subject to the decisions of others, though now I had a voice in them. My sons were capable of running the farm, but the house felt unendurably empty without James. My eldest daughter, Bridget, had married a merchant and established herself in St. Louis. She urged me to come live with her family. After much consideration, I chose St. Louis. The city was vast, noisy, and overwhelming, nothing like the quiet fields of the farm, but reminiscent of the crowded New York streets of my earliest childhood. I settled into the rhythms of urban life. I attended Mass regularly at the parish of St. Bridget of Arran, joined the Altar Society, and occupied myself with my grandchildren. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in October of 1903, 50 years to the very month since we were separated on that dusty stage, my life changed forever. The parish was hosting a large autumn festival and charity auction in the church hall, designed to raise funds for the local orphanage. I attended out of obligation to my daughter, more than enthusiasm. I was 60 years old, comfortable in my quiet routines, and finding the dense crowd somewhat exhausting. I was standing near the edge of the hall, holding a cup of cider and listening to a neighbor complain about the streetcars, when I glanced across the room and saw him. At first, it was merely a feeling, an inexplicable pull of attention. My eyes landed on a man perhaps 20 feet away, speaking quietly with the parish priest. His hair was silver, his face lined with age, his shoulders broad and slightly stooped. There was nothing particularly distinctive about his appearance, and yet everything about him was familiar in a way that made the breath catch in my throat. He turned his head, and the afternoon light from the tall windows caught his face. It was impossible. It could not be. Half a century had passed. I told myself I was a foolish old woman seeing ghosts where there were only strangers. But I knew the shape of those solemn brown eyes. I knew the exact set of that jaw. And then he coughed, a dry, rattling sound, and rubbed his chest with the heel of his hand in the exact same manner the frail 6-year-old boy had done on the orphan train. I set my cup down with trembling hands. I crossed the room, my eyes never leaving the man's face. He did not see me approaching until I stopped directly in front of him. He turned to look at me, a polite smile ready for another parishioner. And then his expression changed. I watched recognition dawn in his eyes. I watched confusion give way to disbelief, and disbelief to a profound, shattering shock. The color drained from his weathered face. His hand reached out, trembling. "Mary," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion I cannot describe. "Thomas," I said, and my voice broke on his name. For a long moment we simply stood there staring at each other, suspended in time while the noise of the festival continued around us. And then we embraced in the middle of that crowded church hall. We clung to each other and wept openly without shame or restraint, while everyone around us stopped to stare. I could feel him shaking in my arms. I buried my face in his silver hair and breathed in the scent of him, trying to convince myself this was real. "I thought you were dead," he gasped. "Mary, I thought I would never see you again." "I am here," I told him, the tears flowing freely down my wrinkled cheeks. "I am here. We have found each other." Someone brought us chairs and we sat holding hands, terrified to let go. We talked for hours. The hall emptied, but still we sat, catching up on half a century of separation. Thomas told me his story first. Mr. Callahan, the blacksmith, had been a hard, a demanding master, but not a cruel one. He had fed Thomas well and taught him a valuable trade, but he was a silent man who believed the past was dead and buried. Thomas had been desperately lonely, crying himself to sleep in the loft above the forge, missing our mother, our father, and me with an intensity that never fully abated. When he was 18, Thomas had tried to find me. He had ridden out looking for the Sullivan farm, but Missouri is a vast state, and he had been given the wrong county name. He had even written letters to the orphan asylum in New York, begging for my location, but the directors had refused to release the records, citing their strict policy of clean breaks. "I thought you had forgotten me," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "When my inquiries led nowhere, I thought you had built a new life and did not wish to be reminded of the orphan train. I thought I meant nothing to you." "No," I said fiercely, gripping his calloused hands. "I wrote to the blacksmith. I begged Mrs. Sullivan to find you. I thought of you every single day." We discovered then that Mr. Callahan had received my letter in 1865, but had thrown it into the forge fire. believing it best not to stir up old grief. We were both deceived. We were both prevented from reaching each other by adults who thought they knew what was best. We wept again then, grieving not only for the 50 lost years, but for the children we had been, torn apart and lied to. But beneath the strangeness of our aged faces was the foundation of those early years. We shared memories no one else possessed, our mother's voice singing Irish lullabies, and the damp walls of our tenement in the 5 Points, the terrifying rattle of the train. Those shared memories created a bridge across 50 years, allowing us to reconnect. I do not regret the years apart, as regret is pointless against circumstances beyond one's control, but I grieve them. I grieve the milestones we did not share, the time that was stolen from us. But I am profoundly grateful for the 20 years we had together after we found each other. From 1903 until 1923, we were once again part of each other's lives. We celebrated births and mourned deaths together. We grew old in each other's company. When Thomas died in the winter of 1923, his lungs finally giving out, I sat beside his bed in his final hours, holding his hand as I had held it when we were children on that dusty stage. He looked at me with eyes that were failing but still clear. I'm glad we found each other, he said, his voice weak. I'm glad I did not die believing you had forgotten me. I never forgot you, I told him, not for a single day. I am now 86 years old. I have outlived nearly everyone I loved in my youth. I have witnessed transformations that would have seemed like sorcery to my younger self. Automobiles, airplanes, the radio. But of all the experiences in my long life, the most profound was recognizing my brother's face across a crowded room. That moment taught me that family bonds, once formed, cannot be entirely destroyed by time or distance. They can be buried, neglected, but they do not die. Even if death is simply the end, I am content. I found my brother. I kept my promise to my mother. And that is enough.